and just let you know how we're going to do this tonight. As before, we will mute everybody's mics and turn everybody's video off except for the speaker once the presentation gets underway, and that just makes it a lot easier for everybody to focus and concentrate. But we encourage you to use the chat function, especially if you have questions that you want to raise for the speaker. And I will try and keep track of those as we go along. And then at the end of our presentation, we'll have a question and answer session. And it's been pretty lively in previous meetings. So people have been really making use of the chat function, and that's worked out pretty well for us. Next month, Mendocino Coast Audubon Society will not actually be hosting a program presentation. It will be, since it's March, it's time for the partnership potluck. And of course, we aren't going to have a potluck again this year. But the Mendocino Parks, Mendo Parks is actually going to host the Zoom meeting. So we're going to do a virtual potluck. And that'll make it a lot easier because you'll know exactly what will be available for you to eat. And that's, we don't have a link yet for that meeting, but once we get that from Mendo Parks, we'll send that to the members and hope you can attend that meeting as well. The potlucks are usually a lot of fun, and hopefully the Zoom meeting will be as well. I've been surprised at how well this has worked out for a lot of different uses. As far as what Mendocino Coast Audubon is up to these days, of course, we are still really not doing field trips. We ordinarily would be looking forward to the March owling trip, but that trip requires carpooling, and carpooling is still way too dangerous. And so we really can't do that trip this year, which is a real shame. It's a very popular trip and very exciting stuff to do. But the limitations on how many cars we could take really restrict that trip and make it impossible logistically for us to manage it this year. So I apologize for that, but we just have to keep on keeping on until we can gradually start resuming our activity. We have restarted the bird walks, and we've been doing the early bird walks on the third Wednesdays. And in fact, we had one last week, and I think it might have been the best bird walk we've ever had in February, which is traditionally a pretty tough month for birding here. But we had over 50 species of birds at the Mendocino Coast Botanical Gardens, which is pretty good diversity, as I say, for this time of year. Just a note too that I finally got around to completing the tally for the Fort Bragg Christmas bird count. And surprisingly, although we had low diversity, we only had 134 species of birds, which is ties for the lowest ever for this count. But the total number of individual birds tallied was back up above trend and above average. We had over 17,000 birds. So that actually was good news to me that we got a lot of birds. And I think a lot of that is because it's a huge year for two species in particular, pine siskins, which have been making the news lately, and yellow-rumped warblers. We had almost 3,500 yellow-rumped warblers on the Fort Bragg count, which is about triple normal. So if it seems like there's a lot of yellow rumps around, apparently there really are. I will mention also that if you're not sick of looking at your computer screen yet, David Jensen and I put together some videos on bird identification, basically on winter birding in the Mendocino Coast. We did that really as part of our Christmas bird count preparation, but the videos have proved really popular and people have really been enjoying them. So those are on our YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube and search for Mendocino Coast Audubon. And in addition to that, you can find all of the Zoom presentations that we have had to date. We have video of those also on our YouTube channel. including an epic 2-hour presentation on the winter birds of the Mendocino coast. And of course, that means that tonight's presentation will also be available on that YouTube channel for people who couldn't see it live. And so you can let your friends know that they can go to that channel and find tonight's presentation. Once again, just to mention that when you have questions, put them in the chat and I'll relay them to our speaker once we get to that point of the presentation. I do see one question already, and yeah, we're most of the yellow rumps myrtles. Not many of us actually make those distinctions, and right here on the coast, I don't have a good feel for what the ratio is, but it's not all that asymmetrical. There are a lot of both myrtle and Audubon's warblers here, and I don't have enough data to really say what that ratio is, whether it's 50-50 or 30-70, but it's in that range, I think. All right, with that, I think that we can go ahead and introduce tonight's speaker. This is a presentation I've really been looking forward to for, I think many of us like to go over to the Central Valley in the wintertime for the spectacular display of the wintering waterfowl there. And that leads to an interest in waterfowl in general and how are they doing and what particular problems and challenges do they face. And so it's perfectly timely to have a presentation on that subject tonight. And I want to introduce Carolyn Brady, who is the Waterfowl Program Supervisor for the California Waterfowl Association. I'm sure she'll tell us a little more about what that entails. And tonight's presentation, of course, is about California mallards, to use the British pronunciation. Carolyn Brady, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me, Tim. I'm very happy to be here to talk to you guys about mallards. I was stressing out about it a little bit at first, just because PowerPoints are always just so much in 45 minutes, but I really enjoy talking about ducks. So I relaxed and I was like, all we're doing is talking about mallards, and I love that. So I don't know if it'll be an epic 2-hour presentation, but you never know. We'll see where the questions lead us.
Well, I hope.
All right. So should I get started then?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. Hi, everybody. Carolyn Brady. As Tim said, I supervise the waterfowl programs for CWA, and I will get right into kind of what CWA does. So we are a 501(c)(3) nonprofit, and we have about 45 to 50 employees. And we do a lot. All of us wear a lot of different hats, between wetland restoration on private and public lands, waterfowl population monitoring and research. We also do policy and a lot of legislative and water law education outreach, which is in school and and field trips, as well as camps and clinics. And then we have our hunt program, which gets new folks into hunting, as well as help retain those that maybe have hunted in the past but don't anymore. And then just doing outreach for getting people more into the outdoors, whether it's archery or rifles or shotguns or just birding and art. So CWA does a whole lot. We're going to really focus on the waterfowl population monitoring and research, as well as just give you guys a generality of California mallards in general. So in the not too distant past, I guess, let me see. So duck hunting is fueled really by duck hunters, obviously. And with the Pittman-Robertson Act and the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, a lot of money for conservation comes from hunters and the money they spend to pursue the resource. So, public lands like national wildlife refuges, those were purchased with money from duck hunters. So duck hunting is super important, whether it's palatable to you or not. It's an important resource to the United States and to the Pacific Flyway especially. Not only because it drives small businesses in those forgotten towns, those sleepy forgotten towns, but it also drives conservation. Because if you need to keep a population abundant so that it can be harvested, then you need to have the habitat to support that population. So originally, the thinking was that all mallards kind of come from the prairie pothole region, and that's called the mid-continent stock. So that's probably what most people are familiar with when you hear duck populations are exploding. You know, shovelers have never seen a better year, and gadwall and mallards, they're all at their top. That's fantastic, and we do get a lot of their dabblers and some of their mallards, but by and far, most of the mallards in our state come from our flyway, and most of which are California and Oregon mallards. So I'm just going to go a little bit in the background because the way that ducks are managed for hunting regulations are based on these population stocks. So it's a big shift to say, hey, wait a second, you know, California mallards are different from mid-continent, so they need to be managed differently. So looking at some of those differences, Bob McLandris, former president of CWA and was also the first biologist for CWA, he really pushed this. And the way he got at it to kind of get the service's attention was by conducting nest searches and nesting studies in multiple regions in the state, and kind of starting to pick out the differences between California mallards and the mid-continent stock. So some big ones are, we've got a lot higher nesting densities in California than the prairie potholes. Our nesting season is also a lot longer because it starts a month earlier. So that would be important to note if you're trying to survey them, because if you start a month after they already began nesting, your survey is not going to be very accurate. And their breeding probability, which is, you know, the chances that they'll breed in a season or not, are more strongly tied to precipitation in California than the potholes, whereas the potholes is tied to wetland abundance, which obviously is tied to precipitation. Because California is so managed and altered, it's more tied to precipitation, kind of what's on there while they're settling their territories. They also happen to have different nesting behavior than the prairie birds, and it's kind of strange and awful funny. So I worked in North Dakota doing some nest searches for Delta waterfowl and I banded ducks for Fish and Game there a couple summers, and you could time on your clock when a hen would take a break. They take a break twice in a day, and you could, to the T, it'd be 8 o'clock, she's back on the nest, and 5 o'clock, she's off the nest. And California, they come and go as they please, and you cannot, they're more laid back, I guess you could say. Some other differences, if you think about it, California is pretty unique because you have a local population of mallards that are here all winter, and then they're here all spring and summer too. So their migration's altered where it's really pretty short and it's within state, or it's really not existent much at all. And California mallards also molt migrate. So not everybody does, and it's something that we're still trying to tease apart how they make this decision. But a large proportion of breeding ducks in California, no matter where in the state they're breeding, will migrate up to northeastern, like the Klamath Basin and up in Alturas, to molt all of their flight feathers and be flightless for 30 to 60 days. So that's an important tidbit, and prairie birds don't really seem to do that too much either. Okay, so another way to tease apart these two populations is to band a whole lot of them. And by doing that, you can kind of get a more distinct idea of where these birds are going, where they're coming from, and kind of get an idea of what your population is doing. So CWA has been banding mallards pre-season, so before duck season begins. Usually it's July and August. We band all of the mallards we can. Fish and Game does as well sometimes. But CWA is the main duck banding agency for the state. And that provides a good idea of what your local production is. So the number of young birds you're capturing compared to the number of adults you're capturing. And then also gives us derivation of the harvest. So looking more closely into that stuff. Again, local production, your age and sex cohorts. And then we also target big numbers of molting adult males. And the reason we target adult males is because their banding data is used in developing the hunting regulations every year. The age and sex info is also very important for that because it basically gives you a description of how your population is doing when you have a good idea of what's our age and sex class and how abundant are each of those cohorts. And then, if you are doing summer banding, CWA has been doing summer banding since 1985. And, you will recapture some birds that you've caught previously years ago. Currently, we're doing pintail trapping, and they have some really crazy high site fidelity to where they winter, especially post-season. So we've caught a pintail on the same location on the same day 3 years apart. Like, it's crazy. So live recaptures also bulks up that data and gives you an idea of survival estimate and harvest estimate and what the pressures are for the different age and sex groups. And like I said before, all of that banding data on California mallards gets put into the adaptive harvest management model that basically spits out what your hunting regulations are each year. We don't need to get into adaptive harvest management, but we can sometime in the future because I have a presentation on that too. Okay, and so this is just a fun video. This is an example of a baited swim-in trap. And will you play? Oh, here we go. So basically, maybe it won't. Okay, next time. I do have a video on file, so maybe we can watch that after. But basically what we do is we have welded wire in the shape of a heart, and it's got a funnel that we bait there in the middle with, we use patty rice, but you can use cracked corn too. And basically, they just feed their way in, and ducks are pretty greedy, so they push each other in, trying to go in to get the food. And then we check those once, sometimes twice a day, and take them out, band them, and toss them right back out. And then let's see if this video will play. This is a rocket net video, which also is not going to play, so we can watch that at the end perhaps. Okay, so harvest derivation, I mentioned earlier, was really important for delineating the two different breeding stocks, because harvest derivation poses the question, you've harvested this bird, where was it produced? So based on long-term banding data, it was discovered that 60% of the mallards that hunters harvest in our state were homegrown in California. So that's a big deal, meaning that the bulk of the mallards that hunters are taking in a season are dictated by how well the production is in a given year in the state. So knowing that, you're going to manage your habitat and your population a lot differently than if you were to continue to work under the assumption that your mallards are all coming from the prairie pothole region. So mallards for our flyway, ducks for our flyway are managed by the Western mallard model. And mid-continent birds, which is Mississippi and Central Flyway, mid-continent birds dictate those harvest regulation packages. Okay, so upon recognizing them as separate breeding stock, well, you need to monitor your breeding stock. So the Department of Fish and Game developed the breeding waterfowl population survey. It was initiated in 1992, and the last current year was 2019. Unlikely that it will take place in 2021 either, unfortunately. But it's important to note that it produces annual estimates. It doesn't give us hard numbers of the exact number of birds that we count. And I know you guys know that because you've done Christmas bird counts. So a lot of people get hung up on those being real numbers, but they are not. They're estimates. And basically what they did was they surveyed the entire state, and they came up with a primary and secondary areas of where they had high densities of breeding ducks. So they slimmed it down to 9 regions. They're all listed there, and they fly the survey. They do the valley and all of the subparts in April, and they do northeastern in May because it's more northernly. The ducks get a little bit of a later start there. So the top 3 breeding species of ducks in California are mallards, gadwall, and cinnamon teal. Mallards are really kind of in the tank, as you can see. Gadwall have been doing okay, and cinnamon teal have been doing all right. Generally speaking, and this goes for like how game birds are managed on a national basis, or waterfowl, I guess, particularly. If you are covering all your bases to get good mallard numbers, chances are that you are accommodating your other species as well. So that is the overall assumption there. So we're going to focus on mallards because they're the most sought after species and they're the most abundant in the state. So the current status is not really that great. As you can see, it's a negative decline. And if we look at this, in 10-year increments, we can see the average is pretty good. And then it's okay. And now it kind of looks like we're averaging for a lower population. So, what's causing this decline? Well, I can tell you one thing is for sure, it is not harvest. So this is the annual mallard harvest on public lands in California. As you can see, it's declining. Oh, that didn't work. That was an action photo or an action graph, but the red is your harvested mallards, and as you can see, it tracks pretty closely with the BPOP decline, which is the black line. So as you have a decline in your breeding population, you see that reflected in your harvest. So that's that main message, which is bad because when you have reduced productivity and reduced harvest, you have less people going out to hunt them, which really hurts small businesses and it hurts conservation money. Okay, so amongst those 9 regions, there are really 3 hotspots within the state where mallards are king. And that consists of northeastern California, the Sacramento Valley, and the San Joaquin grasslands. Those are your top 3 heavy hitters that produce the most mallards and gadwall and cinnamons in the state. All of the regions, not just these 3, but all 9 regions have habitat issues. Water, we were talking earlier, water is always going to be a problem. It always has been, and always will be. And how we manage that for wildlife and where wildlife falls in that list of priorities is something that everyone needs to kind of keep an eye on, because typically if something needs to get cut, it's wildlife. But then, unique to some of the other areas, they struggle with other issues. So upland nesting habitat may not be such an issue in, say, the San Joaquin grasslands, but it's a big issue in the Sacramento Valley. Okay, so now we're looking at the 3 top mallard producing regions in the state and how those populations in each region has changed over time. So as you can see, Sacramento Valley is the green line, and it reigned supreme for quite a while, but northeastern is now the top producer of mallards. So recognizing that shift, you got to scratch your head and say, well, what's going on here? Well, as you can see, the Sac Valley has been reduced down to 19% of the total mallards counted in the BPOP, while northeastern has gone from 20% to 41%. So we have had a major shift in regional breeding populations, and there are some underlying reasons as to why that might be. So again, just to reiterate, the Sac Valley has really gone into the dumps while northeastern has picked up the slack. So we're going to take a closer look at the Sacramento Valley, and then we'll take a look at northeastern. As you guys are fairly familiar with, if you come into the Valley to bird, it's a large, fertile valley that's dominated by agriculture, and there's a few postage-sized stamps of wildlife areas and national wildlife refuges. However, the Sac Valley is also pretty dominated by cultivated rice, which is fantastic. So despite the fantastic rice, again, this is just another graph showing you how poorly the Sac Valley is performing in its mallard number of breeding mallards. And the land use change in this ag dominated region is really what's driving the issues here. So grain, which is wildlife friendly, has gone from 4% to 2%. We look at urban, that's increased 1%. We look at trees like fruit and nut orchards, that's increased 18%. So basically what's going on here is we have a decrease in suitable nesting upland habitat. Well, basically the Sac Valley doesn't have much for natural uplands except for those postage stamps of public lands. And those public lands don't always provide water in the summer either. So what that means is you're dependent on cultivated rice for a summer water source that is consistent and has broad scope in the Sac Valley. That's your water source. If you're lucky, you might find a summer wetland or a riparian area, but those are far and few between. So what most waterfowl have done, this greatly reflects mallards, but we've also found cinnamon teal, pintail, and gadwall in ag fields as well. But basically the suitable habitat basically is suitable ag habitat is the majority of what they have available to them. That's decreasing. And that's unfortunate because the Sac Valley used to be a patchwork of winter planted cereal grains amongst cultivated rice fields. So, you're looking at cereal grains, they're dense and lush and green in April and March when mallards are looking for a place to put their nest. So when that's really the only cover you got available to you, or other things like cover crops like vetch or oats or triticale, or we found them in tomatoes, they're in all sorts of commodities, but by and far cereal grains are the most attractive to breeding ducks. So in the past, there was much more grain and wildlife friendly ag incorporated into this landscape of rice, and that's largely gone away. So again, you've got cultivated rice acting as your surrogate wetlands, and then you have these grain fields as your surrogate uplands, and it's really the perfect mix if the timing were to work out, but it doesn't always. So cereal grains hold high densities of nesting ducks. Their nest success tends to be pretty good because a lot of farmers and farm workers shoot mesopredators like raccoons and possums and all that stuff. Luckily, fox are not really a problem in the Sac Valley, and snakes will also eat eggs. There's all sorts of stuff, but they tend to do pretty well in ag as long as timing is okay. So with the decrease of suitable habitat, we've also had an increase in non-suitable habitat. So tree crops, this isn't here, visualized here, but vineyards have also increased substantially. So basically, and urban spaces have increased slightly, but in the big picture is this isn't good. Permanent orchards offer little to wildlife, and they also have a permanent demand for water year round. And then urban, despite the spread of pavement, the bigger problem is water use and water consumption as urban areas grow. But we also have to keep in mind that farmers are businessmen, and although there are quite a few out there that do what's right in their heart for wildlife when they can afford to, a lot of times they really just can't. And when you look at how commodity prices have changed over the last few decades, that's what's driving what gets put out onto the landscape. So almonds, as everyone knows, are very popular and they're in everything. And the reason for that is because they bring in a very good price. Whereas you look at things like winter wheat or triticale or oats, now they're doing a little bit better, but the price does not compare to what you would make. So you can't hold farmers as the evil person driving bird populations down. We have to look at them as partners in making it better. for wildlife, but also for their livelihood, because that's really the only realistic path forward for that. But again, I mean, this just shows you the change in wildlife friendly and non-wildlife friendly crops in the valley. So again, trees have increased quite a bit, as has urban, whereas range and grain and a lot of other, it's basically field crops and row crops and pasture that are being converted into trees. We're not losing wetlands to trees or anything crazy like that. And the problem with grain is it really just doesn't make a lot of money, and it's a rotational crop. But the problem with trees is they're permanent, so you're not rotating anything anymore. So that is the issue with the Sac Valley. There are solutions, and as I was just telling Tim earlier, there's a lot of reasons to have a positive outlook on it now. You know, we've done leaps and bounds for waterfowl and shorebirds that winter in the Sacramento Valley. They've never been healthier and more abundant, but we have really let our breeding ducks down over the last 10 years because our focus has been so strongly on wintering birds. But now there's been a change, perhaps a paradigm shift. CWA has multiple programs. The delayed wheat harvest program kicked off for the first time last year, and it was very successful. Basically, we paid farmers $30 to $40 an acre for their grain to delay harvest of their grain until July 15th. They could choose to delay the harvest anytime between July 1st and July 15th. And depending on the date that they chose to delay harvest was the amount of money they would get paid. And even with a truncated application period, which was only 3 weeks, we got almost 11% of the total wheat acreage planted in the Sac Valley through applications. We had enough funding for, it was just under 2,000 acres. And basically what we did was we went out and scored each field, and the fields that were located near planted rice or a wetland or a riparian area were those that scored highest. So that was fantastic. And then our egg salvage program kind of goes hand in hand with that. Egg salvage has been around since the 80s. Basically, that's just CWA facilitating between farmers and federally permitted duck hatcheries. And we help farmers get nests out of their field before they chop, disc, harvest, anything that they have to do that's normal agricultural work. We can get nests out of the field into the hatchery, where they are hatched, reared to 5 weeks of age, banded, and released into a wetland habitat. So the Egg Salvage program, while it is not a solution, it is a really fantastic tool for outreach. We get kids out to band ducks and give tours at the hatchery. The birds are raised with minimal human interaction. Basically, they come in as an egg and they're not touched again until we pick them up to sex them and band them. And then they're touched one more time to be released. But again, that is very labor intensive and expensive, which is what spawned the delayed wheat harvest program, because it'd be much better for everybody if the eggs could just hatch naturally with the hen, and then no one has to drive all over the state to pick up the nests. Okay, and then as I said before, CWA does a lot of habitat restoration, and there's been more focus on creating brood habitats and upland, natural upland nesting habitats. And then CWA also, we partake in, we used to do the breeding population survey for the state. We would assist with that, but now we assist with the Nevada BPOP, and we also help with midwinter surveys and goose surveys. And the annual banding efforts for mallards and pintail, we do that for the state to get the data we need to set responsible regulations. And then the Department of Fish and Wildlife has the Presley program, and the Presley program basically incentivizes private landowners to have summer habitat on their private property and manage it for summer breeding ducks. And lastly, the NRCS has various ag incentive programs to create wildlife habitat. For example, the Rice Commission, CWA is partnering with them on their cover crop nest cover program, which basically says, hey, if you're a rice grower and you're planning to fallow your land because of voluntary agreements and lack of water, that's great. We will pay you to put a cover crop on it. And hey, if you keep that cover crop till July 15th, we'll pay you again. So it's a win-win. It helps with soil conservation and soil health, and it helps ground nesting birds hatch safely without being chopped up. I'll throw in there too that, you know, we beyond red-winged blackbirds, typically you'll get northern harriers and American bitterns. They're often in the same habitat as ducks, as well as turkeys and pheasants, and occasionally a short-eared owl. Okay, so that is the Sac Valley. We've got issues with habitat, mostly upland nesting, because rice is really pulling its weight in providing the summer water. If it were not for rice, then the Sac Valley would have double the issues and the population would probably be doubly worse. So now we're going to look at Northeastern, because as mentioned before, Northeastern is now really carrying the weight of the breeding population for the state. So we're going to look at the challenges in Northeastern. I'm going to kind of focus on the Klamath Basin, because although Honey Lake and Modoc and all of that area is part of Northeastern, the Klamath Basin plays a particularly important role, and it also traditionally has water more frequently than the rest of that region. So traditionally, our breeding ducks from California and Oregon would migrate to Northeastern to migrate their wings, their wing feathers. They're also now the top producing duck region in the state. So we have all of our ducks, not all of them, but a large portion of our ducks that breed everywhere in the state, they go up to Northeastern. And now you also have most of your breeding ducks are up there already. So you've got a lot of important parts of our breeding stock all in one area. And if you have all of your breeding stock up there, that's also where most of your production is going to be. However, Northeastern is riddled with water issues and water restrictions far worse than the Sacramento Valley, which may be hard to believe, but they don't have something like CVPI to guarantee water to wildlife areas and refuges. So water restrictions in Northeastern are especially bad because of the fact that a big bulk of our breeding stock is up there. So it's a spring-fed intermountain basin. It's an arid system. It's part of Southern Oregon, Northeastern California. The reason, beyond having ecological droughts, which every region in the state suffers through, it's got political droughts. The KBRA, which would have helped aplenty with sorting out water rights and water allocations to the various groups, fell through, I think, in 2010, and that would have really been helpful if it had not. But basically, you've got a lot of people at the table that want this water, between tribes, farmers, and now you have endangered species between suckers and salmon. To be honest with you, the refuge isn't even seated at the table to discuss what water they need because they're not considered. So it's a highly altered system. And to kind of understand that better, if we look at the Klamath Basin in the 1900s, in the middle there, here you've got Tule Lake, you've got Clear Lake over here on the east, and you've got Lower Klamath over here. Upper Klamath is up here, okay? So the modern Klamath Basin wetland landscape is far restricted. So what was once Tule Lake are now restricted to 2 small sumps here. And then what was once Lower Klamath is been restricted to this small green blob here. However, this little blue blob here, that's unit 2 where like Turn Island is. You guys might know there's like usually a nesting eagle over here in the road that separates unit 2 and 3. Unit 2 is the only unit that has water right now. It's the only unit that had water since July. So LK, if you're looking at Lower Klamath, the only place really has water is this little blue blob. Whereas Tule Lake, the sumps both have water, but they're also at their all-time low. So currently not looking great. Sorry for the resolution on this. This was an aerial picture taken of Lower Klamath in July of 2020. So again, that's Turn Island. This is unit 2. Typically there would be water on all of that. This is unit 3. There would be water extending out here and in here, but there was not. So it looks worse than that now. And then again, this is an aerial photo of Lower Klamath and the condition it was in October. So you can see there's water here. That's Turn Island again. And in unit 3, there's probably some in the ditch by the road, but hard to hunt waterfowl when there's no water. So that's not good. And Tule Lake experienced one of the worst botulism outbreaks this summer, but we will get into that in a minute. Okay. So there's been some massive changes, and basically the biggest portions of the basin now are reservoirs, basically Upper Klamath and Clear Lake. Upper Klamath is kept pretty full when possible for suckers and salmon. And, you know, both refuges are comprised of thousands of agriculture as well, but that's also been helpful in many regards as far as leaving standing grain for wildlife, as well as rotating between wetlands and agriculture to manage noxious weeds and produce better ag. Okay, well, what does this all really mean for the ducks? Well, water restrictions during breeding season, you're gonna have lower nest densities, lower nest survival, lower duckling survival, which equates to less ducks in the fall and winter skies. What does it mean for post-breeding ducks? It sucks, because basically it means you've got low quality wetlands, low quantity you have a low number of wetlands, and that leads to crowded conditions. So when you have the bulk of your breeding stock in one region, on top of a large proportion of ducks from the other regions in the state and Southern Oregon arriving to molt there, because it's a traditional molting area, because they're thousands of acres. These wetland units are thousands of acres. So, I mean, you're not going to find something like that in the valley, and they're permanent water, and there's cover, and there's food. So of course you're going to go there. But the problem with that is botulism lives in the soil in most wetlands in the country. And when you have the right conditions for botulism to start, which is low water and high temperatures, and you have overcrowding, you're going to have huge problems with disease. So in the summer, it's botulism, and in the winter, it is cholera. But so, as I alluded to earlier, 2020, there were at least 60,000 dead ducks, geese, and shorebirds picked up out of Tule Lake Sump 1A. And it was a very unfortunate situation because the refuge staff was somewhat shorthanded. Our duck banding project turned into disease pickup detail. It was rather unpleasant, but it was an interesting learning experience, that is for sure. So again, we're concentrating all our birds into one of the last regions in the state that has decent habitat, and then we're killing them all with disease because they too have water problems and not enough water to make it work. So fall migrating ducks, again, they have the same problems. Quality and quantity of wetlands are not available. So what happens when you start getting all of these early migrants coming through? Well, they arrive, they realize, you know, they may stay for a couple of days, or they may just keep going because, I mean, this year especially, it seemed that ducks arrived much earlier in the valley, and that's bad for agriculture because basically what they do is, you know, public lands and duck clubs are not flooded yet for duck season come August, September, even beginning of October, things aren't necessarily fully flooded, certainly not this year. So you have all these birds arriving because where they would usually stay in Klamath Basin, well, there's nowhere to stay. So why would you stay there? You keep moving south. For example, before duck season started in Northeastern in early October, they did an aerial survey before it got shut down. And there were between Tule Lake and Lower Klamath, 100,000 birds. 100,000 birds. That is a drop in the bucket of what it should be at that time of year. So where do those birds go? Well, they're going to come down to the valley a lot sooner during fall migration. During spring migration, they're going to go up there and it's going to be the same conditions of not a lot of wetlands and low quality. So again, they're going to be crowded. And when the weather drops, when the temperature drops, then you have cholera outbreaks because you have crowded conditions. Again, you can get massive die-offs. So what does this mean to ducks? Basically, it's not good. And the solutions for the Klamath Basin and Northeastern in general are they're not as silver lined as the Sac Valley. For the non-consumptive user, you know, the Basin serves as a hotspot for birding. They have the Eagle Festival there every February. The Basin is important not only to waterfowl, but to migrating shorebirds and raptors. And they depend on a lot of the same habitat the waterfowl do. Obviously, the raptors are depending on the waterfowl abundance. So, and the small towns that really depend on this kind of traffic are suffering greatly. I mean, 2020 shuttered a lot of doors, but those small towns that really were hoping for some fall business fell flat. So that was pretty tough. And for the hunting public, this means that, you know, until we have both of these regions figured out and a good plan for recovery, it'll be a little while before we see an increase in our mallard populations, because without these two regions working together, you can't have one without the other. We need both of them online, basically. And Northeastern is definitely a harder problem to crack. And then this is just going back to the botulism. So I believe what was like physically picked up was 30,000 birds carcasses, and that was mainly shorebirds and ducks. I think shorebirds made up 10 or 15% of that. But we did recover 127 duck bands off of the dead birds. And of the 127, 112 of them were banded in California. They were banded in California during the breeding season, which means they were your breeding stock. 57 of them likely hatched here. So basically taking a snapshot of those 60,000 birds that died from botulism this year, if we look at this banding data and extrapolate it out to that, I mean, we can say that we just killed a rather large chunk of our breeding stock. And that it was made up of birds that both molt migrated there and were there nesting with a brood. And I mean, hard to pick up ducklings when, you know, that's what you're banking on, and you're picking them up in August. It's just very disheartening. So some solutions. Again, this is a harder problem to crack, but it's really going to depend on policy and political decisions, and making wildlife refuges, allowing them to have a seat at the table would be a great first start. Farmers have actually been a really good partner in this battle. When they have extra water to spare, they do transfer it to the refuge, and that happened this summer. There's just it's a really complicated issue that could be a 2-hour presentation in itself. There are opportunities for the wheat program up there because there's a lot of cereal grain that's grown in Northeastern. And CWA is also working with Delta Waterfowl and Oregon State on a redhead project that will also overlap with suckers. So basically they're going to be looking at semi-permanent wetlands and how they benefit breeding waterfowl, suckers, and other birds like ibis. So this year will be a pilot year where they really are just going to try and figure out what bird guilds they can get the most robust data set from. So I am praying that there's water up there so that there are birds breeding up there, period. And that is it for questions, although I do have a few more slides, and I can also show you guys those videos that didn't play separately. But Tim, I believe that concludes it.
All right. Well, thanks very much, Carolyn. Although I think you kind of bummed us all out a little.
I know. Well, I mean, it isn't all roses right now, and it's unfortunate, but I mean, I'm glad that at least it's now getting some folks' attention, because that's the first step, is making a racket and saying, hey, this isn't right. Because the Klamath Refuge Complex in particular is a real heartbreaker, because, you know, it was the first waterfowl refuge created, and now it can't even get a drop of water.
Yeah, I guess my first question would be, where do we raise hell? Who should we be talking to? And
Your congressman.
Oh, okay.
And, you know, CWA, I can email it to Tara later on, or you, Tim, but CWA does have a Klamath Refuge webpage. We have a task force, and they've been working on a film to show legislators, and there's a lot going on. There's a lot in the mix, and the botulism this summer got a lot of media attention. So that was really helpful too.
yeah, well, our congressman is Jared Huffman, and he will be a receptive audience, I think.
Oh, good.
The question is going to be, you know, who else can we influence? Because he's already probably on side with us. And
Yeah. I mean, what's tough is it's DC stuff, really. I mean, we've got Jeff Fulberg is our water lawyer, and he's retiring in June. Sad to see him go, but he's been working really hard with all the stakeholders in the basin on this. And then we have Mark Henley, who is our VP of policy. So he's back and forth at the Capitol here, and then he goes over to DC. Well, he used to go over somewhat regularly, but less so now.
yeah. Well, I think I know that several of us would like to see the videos if you can get them to work.
Let's do that.
We do have a question that's kind of related to what you and I were just talking about. Is there a way to purchase water rights specifically for the waterfowl?
Sorry, say that one more time.
Is there a way that organizations like yours or ours can join up and purchase water rights to get more water?
That's a great question. So again, okay, let me write these notes down of what I need to follow up with. Source, contact. This is a task force question for sure. I'm sure they would very much welcome having non-hunters make a racket is almost more important than having hunters make a racket, because hunters are never happy. Like, it's expected for them to make a racket.
Yeah, well, the environmentalists run into the same problem.
Yeah, exactly. So this is the oh, I'm not sharing it. Hold on. Of course. Let me see. Screen share you. Okay. All right, there we go. This is the baited swim and trap you were just playing. Ah. All right, we'll do that. So basically they swim in to the funnel because we bait the funnel, and then they get pushed right in. And we have a little float there on the side for them to haul out and rest. Some interesting things I've had in North Dakota. There was an eagle sitting on top of the nest when I got there, on top of the trap when I got there. We've had otters in the trap. We've even had elk decide to take a peek. Let's see.
I would think having an eagle wow, what was that?
Oh, that one. Oh, it did show. Okay. So this is the rocket net. This is what we use to catch pintails, but just last Friday we caught like 30 mallards too. So it'll catch anything that's there. So what we do for this is, you're looking for large concentrations of birds post-season, which mainly they're in rice fields eating waste grain. And we scout for them, and then we bait them with a strip of paddy rice near an edge. And then we have a net laid out with low-class explosives. So you have a viewing spot. So when, let's see, here we go. So then basically, yeah, you view it, and when you have a lot of birds, you have another person detonate it. So it's like stereo wire that you haul out maybe like a quarter mile to detonate it. You basically don't want them to see you because then they're not comfortable. But no birds were harmed in that, actually. I can tell that to you with confidence. And then this is a video of a wheat farmer harvesting his wheat, and that right there is a hen sitting on her nest refusing to budge, which is why the wheat program and egg salvage are important, not only because it rescues nests, but it also rescues your adult breeders that are so far along in incubation they don't want to move.
Yeah.
I think that was it. Oh yeah, and then a mallard. This is at one of the egg salvage hatcheries. It's always so cool to see ducks hatching. It's exhausting.
Yeah.
So those are all the videos, I believe.
They're kind of precocial, right? They
Yeah.
don't want how to feed or anything like that. They
Nope.
don't really do a lot of mothering.
So the hen lays 1 egg a day, and her Drake boyfriend, which is only for the season. So mallards pair up by December. Almost every mallard is got a pair. Come March, once it starts getting warm, they'll start scouting for a place to nest. And then she'll start laying 1 egg a day. He basically guards her to keep her safe from single males that are looking for a quick hit. And so once she's done laying her eggs, usually it's like 9 to 10 eggs per clutch, then the male says, "It was great knowing you, but I could go hang with my buddies. See you later." And he leaves to either go find a new girlfriend or try to sneak in a copulation. And when he gives up on that, then he goes off to go molt with his buddies. So that's why you can get large numbers of molting adult males, because they're all deadbeat dads that leave their honey sitting on the nest. That's boring. 2 breaks a day, not for me. They leave and they go have a good old time and molt their feathers and do all that. So it's easier to catch them right away. And then when you're catching, these are ducklings, so you'll catch hens with their broods. But so once they hatch after 28 days, takes them about 12 to 24 hours to dry off from that, they're all wet. So they fluff up, and then within 24 hours, they follow mom out of the nest, and she takes them straight to somewhere to go feed. They feed themselves, and she waterproofs them with her own glands, because that gland doesn't kick in for them until they're like 5 or 6 weeks old. So they're waterproofed by her, and then they follow her around until they're close to fledging, and then she says bye-bye.
Huh. So when you raise them in a hatchery, how do you get them to that point?
Well, that's why the hatchery is not preferred. So the survival of these ducklings is not as good as a wild duckling, because they're kind of dum-dums. Like, they don't have mom to be like, "Hey, that's a short-eared owl. Hey, that's a red-tailed hawk. Like, maybe don't hang out on this barren road in a group of 20. But like gadwall and wood ducks and cinnamon teals seem to do better because they don't have that big gang mentality. Like, they'll go and hide. Whereas mallards, you release them and you see them go off in a big bubble. Even if you separate them out, like, we'll release, 10 in one spot and 10 in another, and they find each other. But it also depends on the year and the habitat. Like, if it's a good water year and there is a lot of water out on the landscape, they'll do better. But in those low years, Sassoon Marsh, for example, whether you're wild or egg salvage, if the salinity is really high, it's tough to be a baby.
Yeah.
But we release them when they're 5 weeks, so they can't fly yet, but they're fully feathered. They're not waterproof per se. They start getting into doing that, preening themselves and spraying the oil all over. But they're not, the California summers are not too chilly that they can't make it.
Do you have data on the success rate?
Yeah, I did a poster. It's hard to do survival estimates on them because the survival models require an adult and juvenile example, which you can do that with wild mallards and banded wild mallards, but you can't do that with egg salvage because they're never adults. They're always young of the year. So we did harvest pressure. So what we looked at was, okay, how far away from where we released them were they shot? versus for a wild bird, if we caught them in a swim-in trap, chances are they're going to be in that general area. So how far did the wild birds get shot from where we banded them in the trap? And so looking at just local wild birds and hatchier birds, so both are flightless, and you see, okay, how far did they go before they were shot? Well, egg salvage females traveled the least, but egg salvage males traveled almost as far as wild males. So, and then the other interesting thing was egg salvage birds aren't just shot up in opening day and that's the end of them. They're shot consistently through duck season, which I know still sounds horrific if you're not a hunter. But the good news is we do have evidence of them surviving. And basically once they make it through one duck season, you can pretty much consider them a wild duck. So we've caught egg salvage birds sitting on nests. In fact, 13% of those banded birds we picked up out in Klamath Refuge were egg salvage birds. All were 2 to 5 years old. The oldest was 9 years old. None of them were ever released in the Klamath Basin, which means they learned to molt migrate to the Klamath Basin as egg salvage birds. And that like totally blew my mind. So, I mean, really interesting stuff. No, it's not cost effective. It's a feel good Band-Aid, but it also does, I mean, they are helping to like they're nesting and producing ducklings. So it's not like they're taking away from the population, basically.
Yeah, it's not like it's a waste of time, but it isn't gonna.
Yeah. I mean, you can't do it on a broad scale, but wheat program you can, and wheat program really kind of functions in the same way, but easier. And wheat program, you don't have that survival issue, you know, they're with mom. So it's the best case scenario. So I really push that over egg salvage, but egg salvage is unavoidable in general because there will always be cover crops being chopped up and incorporated, and there will always be mallards nesting in chickpeas and tomatoes. So
how long do they actually live? What's the expected?
I would say like your average wild mallard's 2 years old. I mean, if you look at harvest pressure, you're in a season, I would say, I think it's like 60% chance of being harvested by a duck hunter if you're a male mallard, and it drops to I think 30% if you're a young female mallard. If you're an adult, it's lower because you know the game.
Yeah, warier.
Yeah, I mean, and another interesting side note, the reason that mojos, the battery powered wing rotating decoys, that you're not allowed to use mojos until December. The reason you're not allowed to use them till December is because they're highly effective in attracting birds and thus killing them. And so what we realized was by using mojos and being super effective at killing mallards as soon as duck season starts, we're whacking the crap out of our local breeding stock. So I was like, hey, let's wait and use the mojos when the other stock of birds comes, and then we can use it on them and not just shoot up all of our California birds. So I thought that was so interesting. I was like, that makes a lot of sense. But duck hunters get upset at, we can't use our mojos. It's like, yeah, but it's for a really good reason.
Yeah. What an incredibly complicated situation. I had a question going way back when you started about the difference between prairie mallards and the California mallards, and you talked about molt migration. What do the prairie mallards do for molt migration?
I'm sure that they have some level of molt migration, and I should definitely know the answer to that. But I don't have the answer off the top of my head at the moment. They definitely, like California, the males will leave earlier to go molt in large numbers in traditional areas. But I think the difference too with the prairie pothole birds is they're not as restricted to habitat options. The number of wetlands on the landscape in the prairies is dependent on precip, right? Whereas in California, it is and it isn't. It depends on how much rice gets planted. It depends on how much water we decide to release from the reservoirs. It depends on how much water the wildlife refuges decide to hold on to and not drain as soon as duck season's over. So all that stuff kind of plays a big role in that. I'm sure that prairie mallards migrate as well. They just have more options of where they can go.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. They can scatter over a much larger landscape. Do the duck clubs buy water?
There was, for the Klamath Basin, they were working out a water transfer deal for the refuge. And last I heard, somehow that got mucked up, but not because of the landowner or the refuge, but the BOR and transferring and yada yada. So, I mean, duck clubs have various degrees of water rights depending on when they were purchased. So some duck clubs definitely are sitting better than others as far as having the ability to get water. And then, you know, it just depends on what groundwater pumping abilities they have and what water district they're in for, you know, Sigma and all that. I mean, water is getting more and more regulated. That taking a little off the top at a duck club is kind of hard to do.
Yeah, yeah, that's a continuing theme in California. We've always had fights over water, and they're just getting worse and worse because there's more and more demands on the water.
Well, it's, you know, it was another interesting perk out at Egg Salvage. We realized a lot of these duck club owners will put summer water on their property so they can get these egg salvage ducks, because they think, yeah, bring them and then you can release them here and then we'll see them on opening day. And it's like, they're gonna leave by opening day, but sure, as long as you put the water out, that works for me.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Don't disabuse them.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, I don't see any more questions coming up on chat. And I don't know if people want to just sit around and listen to you and I chat all night long, but I think I probably could easily do that.
There's so much. I mean, it's so, everything's so connected, and it's just, it's so amazing. And once you think you got a duck or a species figured out, they do something completely different. You're like, oh, okay.
Yeah, evolution hasn't stopped happening.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, we're in a period of very rapid evolutionary change because of the extreme environmental stress.
Well, you know, the last time that we had a comprehensive breeding mallard study in California was in the 80s. So I've been pushing for that. We've been putting a lot of transmitters on birds in a collaborative study with USGS. And I mean, we had to put out maybe 600 transmitters over the last 5 years on various species. And last year I made a big push to capture ag nesting hens, because I really wanted to know, you know, is this something you guys do repeatedly every year? Is it a preference? And of those, we had one that lasted 2 years, and she nested in the Sutter area in ag. And then she started late. She started in June, which is super abnormal. But if you think about when rice gets planted, it doesn't really get water until May. So she started in June. She failed. She flew a couple fields over and nested in another ag field, appeared to be successful, had her brood for a bit, seemed to have lost her brood, and then flew up to Delavan to molt, went over to the Butte Sink for the winter, and then came right back to like 2 fields away from where we caught her the first time and started nesting in June again. And I was like, this is bizarre. And I was like, we need to have more. We need to know more, because how much of our population is in ag? Probably most of it, if you look at the land cover.
Yeah.
And so working with farmers is really, in my opinion, the path forward for waterfowl or wildlife conservation, any kind of bird conservation.
Yeah, well, they have all the land.
A lot of opportunity. Well, they have all the land, and it's not going to go away anytime soon, but it can change in a hurry, and it can change for the worse.
Yeah, the ag practice has changed very rapidly, and yeah, we've been really caught off guard, I think, by a lot of and that's a story across not just North America, but the whole world.
Well, you know, it kind of goes back to paying for ecological services. You know, it's not to say that they are providing an ecological service, but we don't pay them for it. So why would they do it? You know, and that's kind of one way to look at an incentive program a little bit easier. You know, with wheat, we kind of lucked out because the prices are in the tank. So it's a lot easier to incentivize. You know, $30 to $40 an acre is way cheaper than buying land to restore it or anything else. So
yeah,
I don't know. I think that's the future of conservation, is we got to figure out a stronger partnership with farmers.
Yeah, and again, it's a familiar theme common to a lot of conservation questions, is how do you put an economic value on ecosystem
Yeah,
services? They have
exactly.
economic value, but nobody knows how to assign that and then how to make it marketable. Yeah,
Well, we'll figure it out when it's too late, I'm sure.
yeah, very likely. That's what we're all worried about.
That's
I mean,
what we tend to do.
I've certainly seen the conversion of ag land to fruit and nut tree crops. Just, you can see that firsthand. Just those of us that go over to the Central Valley once a year can see
It
areas.
inches in closer every year. There's
Oh,
another
yeah.
new field.
Those immense areas of orchards out on the west side in what was formerly just barren desert. There was no water there.
Well, and now you have a fiber board company there. So, you know, why post harvest flood your rice when you can bale it and send it and get paid to make fiberboard and save your money and don't flood it. So,
Yeah.
I mean, there's all sorts of crazy things and going on. And, you know, that's part of the frustrating thing too. Like, we can make a vote with what we purchase, but that really only goes so far. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah, it's
I have a question about, well, I posted a question in the chat. I was part of a push for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to create a new revenue stream for the National Wildlife Refuges, because the depletion of the number of waterfowl hunters, and there are way more, even the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's own stats show that there are way more birders and bird photographers and wildlife observers than there are hunters, but they just refuse to create a separate revenue stream for non-hunters. What's the
so
what's
what
your
did you
group's-
suggest? Did you suggest some kind of like a stamp type of deal? You know, one of the bills CWA was pushing for was to increase the state waterfowl stamp by $5. And then the proceeds from that would go to breeding habitat conservation only. But what avenue did you suggest in raising those funds for non-consumptive users?
Well, we started with just an alternative stamp for non-hunters, and then we went to changing it to a pass. So it wasn't, you know, a stamp that went on your hunting license. We were going to make it into more like a credit card pass, but the hunting community was totally against it. They wanted nothing to do with it. And
I mean,
we tried for 7 or 8 years. Actually, way back before myself and my partner were into doing it. Paul Basin, you must be familiar with him. I don't know. I thought he's part of the CWA. I don't know. Or maybe he's just done some presentations there, but it just didn't go anywhere. So now, as wildlife, as waterfowl hunters keep decreasing, the revenues for refuges keep decreasing.
I wonder where you got that backlash from the hunting community, because I mean, now anyways, the tone is, and you also have to consider, okay, so within the waterfowl community, you have waterfowl research and you have waterfowl hunters. Yes, there's considerable overlap. However, the way that both approach problems is quite different. So,
Yeah.
I mean, the waterfowl research world definitely recognizes the fact that they need the support of all bird groups in this effort for habitat conservation. Waterfowl hunters are a more diverse community that may not understand that as well. But the last I heard about, you know, birders or non-consumptive users was there was a push to get a non-consumptive use item into the national duck stamp. And I know they did that for 1 year, but then they didn't the following year and yada, yada, yada. But I could not tell you why hunters would not be supportive of having birders chip in, because that's definitely what everybody needs.
Yeah. Yeah, we kind of we kind of backpedaled with our push, when the last administration came in, because they were, non-environmental all over. So
Yeah.
that pretty much ended our push. So
Yeah.
I don't know. There's got to be a way for non-hunters, besides buying a duck stamp, to put money into the mix.
I mean, the fact that you guys are active is a great start. And promoting that and getting more people involved is a great start, just like hunting. But I agree. I mean, there's obviously room to grow in that direction to raise more funds for jointed effort on a resource everybody cares about.
I know National
agree.
Audubon Society is grappling with the same exact question, and they've made some efforts to try to come up with something, because the duck stamp program worked so well. I mean, that has become a model for everybody to look at and say, holy cow, people will actually voluntarily cough up their own money for these things if they perceive a benefit. And
Right.
so a lot of other, Audubon and other organizations have been looking at that model and trying to figure out, how do we adapt that to the way we do things? And it hasn't been all that easy to do.
Yeah, I guess there have been several states that, and maybe what you suggested is a better idea, is go statewide with an opportunity, because
Yeah, work your way up. If you start with the state, you got a little more political clout, and then once a few states are doing something, then you can start to get some attention at the federal level.
Have you talked to the non-game state guy?
No, I haven't.
Clipperton, I think is his last name. I'll put that on my list of things to follow up with. I can get you his info. He'd be worth talking to and asking about, because
sure, great.
In the flyway meetings, so he would know.
Great.
So it sounds like your research is pretty much entirely, I mean, CWA is doing its own thing. How much do you get, do you do much collaborative work with environmental organizations?
Well, I mean, we had Audubon came up. We hosted quite a few people. Really, the refuge hosted them. I mean, we were just up there helping to run boats and all that. But with the botulism, we had a lot of different bird groups come up to see it firsthand. And then outside of that, I mean, CWA is on the Central Valley Joint Venture Board. And that's, with Audubon, TNC, Wildlife Conservation Board, and I mean, the CVJV has, it's got multiple bird groups. So I mean, and we definitely, whenever you can throw in non-waterfowl related positives of what you're doing, that's definitely always included.
Yeah.
I mean, did you have some kind of suggestion?
No, I'm just trying to get a feel for what's already happening, and so we can think about how we can direct our efforts. I mean, I think that I am not plugged into the network very well to know what California Audubon and National are already doing on this issue, except I know that, too often we get calls to action when a crisis has already developed. And so, everybody drop what you're doing and write a letter in the next 48 hours to the Secretary of the Interior and tell him not to dump all the water in the ditches. And, by that time it's way too late. So what we really need is a ground up effort that starts moving towards, some long-term goals. And I just need to find out what California and National are doing on that.
Well, I mean, I think it'd be good to start with your public lands, because if you start noticing that, they're degrading or they're often dry, those lands belong to everybody. So everyone should be upset if they're going to the dump. Basically. Yeah. I mean, you can say we've got so many acres of wild lands for wildlife in this country, but if they can't function as such because they don't have water, it doesn't count, but we're still counting it as such.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So functionality is huge, especially in California.
Yeah.
So did you have a name for somebody that I could contact in the
For-
state?
Yeah, so
For
I'm gonna
the-
follow up. I'll send an email to Tim and I will get a contact for the non-game person in the state, the Klamath Basin website that CWA has going, and a contact for the task force to direct questions about buying water rights.
Awesome.
Cool.
Thank you.
And I think
got it.
Larry, I'm pretty sure I have your email.
Yeah, shoot me an email and I'll respond to you. If not tonight, then tomorrow, and I'll get you that stuff. And I can share that I can share like that the botulism was actually an infographic, so I can send that to you guys too.
All right, very good. I think that probably is about all the time we should take up with you.
Well, it was a lovely evening to talk about mallards. I appreciate the opportunity.
Well,
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Oh, good, thank you.
yeah, I
And
did.
enjoy that weather over there on the coast.
In spite of the dismal message, I enjoyed the talk a great deal, and I really want to thank you for taking the time and being so willing to stay and chat with us about it after the presentation. That was a
You
lot of
got it.
fun.
If you have any follow-up ideas for presentations, let me know.
All right.
All right, I hope to talk
Very
to you guys
well,
again soon.
It sounds like you have a bunch of things we could talk about.
Oh, for sure. All right, enjoy your evening.
Thanks a lot. You too.
See ya.
Good night, folks. Thanks a lot for joining us. That was, I think that was an eye opener.